Days before my birthday. I knew my sister would invent a crisis so my parents would cancel the event. Mom said, "We're canceling your birthday. Your sister needs us." Dad texted, "You're the strong one." That pattern had finally gone too far, so when they chose her again, I packed up, left for good, and never came back. 3 days before my 30th birthday, my mother called to tell me the celebration was canceled. There was no genuine emergency. My younger sister, Paige, had fought with her boyfriend, and once again, her distress had become more important than anything happening in my life. "We're canceling the dinner," Mom said before I had even finished saying hello. "Your sister needs us." I stared at the wine-engraved place cards and receipts for the restaurant photographer and family transportation. 40 people had promised to come, and I believed my family would finally let me have one day. "What happened this time?" I asked. Mom said Paige and her boyfriend had argued and that Paige was devastated. Before I could respond, my father sent a text that said, "You're the strong one, Dahlia. You'll understand." I had heard it after missed graduations, holidays, promotions, and every milestone displaced by Paige. In our family, strong meant safe to disappoint. This time, though, I had seen the sabotage coming. A few days earlier, Paige had complained that my birthday plans were excessive. She questioned the photographer, the guest list, and why turning 30 required a whole production. Then, almost on schedule, she announced that she was emotionally falling apart and needed the entire family around her. In the past, I would have negotiated for a smaller dinner and pretended it meant the same thing. Instead, I called the restaurant and transferred the reservation to a local charity that served families going through medical treatment. I packed one suitcase, moved the money from the account my parents could still access, and drove 4 hours toward the lake property my grandfather had left behind when he died 8 months earlier. My family assumed I was throwing a temporary fit. They thought I would cool down, feel guilty, and come back ready to comfort Paige. They did not know Grandpa Edwin had expected this, or what he had hidden among his papers. 10 years later, his final message would reveal the full cost. The lake house stood at the end of a private road my mother had always described as dangerous, inconvenient, and impossible to maintain. Mom discouraged me from visiting alone. She said Grandpa Edwin was stubborn, secretive, and obsessed with old grievances. Yet, he was the only person who noticed when I was disappointed and remembered what I loved. He treated my art as something worth protecting, instead of an indulgence I should abandon whenever Paige needed reassurance. After his death, Mom told me he had left behind a deteriorating cabin, several acres of worthless land, and years of unpaid maintenance. She urged me to sell it and divide the proceeds among them and Paige. Whenever I asked to see the estate documents, she claimed the attorney was still resolving complications. Believing her was easier than admitting she might be hiding something. I arrived after dark to find the porch light on. A man in a charcoal jacket stepped outside as I parked. For 1 second, I thought of Grandpa. Then he introduced himself as Vaughn Keller Edwin's estate attorney. "Your grandfather told me you might come here after your 30th birthday," Vaughn said. I asked whether Grandpa had predicted the cancellation. Vaughn did not smile. "He predicted your mother would create a reason you could not celebrate it." He unlocked the house and led me into Grandpa's study. His reading glasses were still beside a half-finished crossword. On the desk was a photograph of me at 17, holding a charcoal sketch. Vaughn placed a thick folder in front of me. Inside was my grandfather's will signed 2 years earlier. It named me, Talia Mercer, as beneficiary of the lake property, 32 acres, and control of his land development company. The assets were worth millions. A resort group had already offered to purchase part of the shoreline, but Grandpa had rejected the proposal because the construction would damage the lake. He wanted to preserve the land and build the artist's retreat we had once imagined. Then Vaughn opened a second folder. "There is another condition you need to understand," he said. "You received full control on your 30th birthday. Until then, your mother held temporary administrative authority." My excitement vanished as I looked at the records. What did she do with it? For nearly 2 years, my mother had been withdrawing money from the estate's operating account. She labeled the withdrawals as maintenance, legal costs, repairs, and management. The money paid Paige's rent debts, retreats, failed ventures, and a luxury wedding venue, even though she was not engaged. More than $400,000 was missing. Vaughn had warned Grandpa, who amended the trust, to transfer control directly to me at 30. Grandpa believed that if my mother knew I would inherit everything, she would pressure me into signing it away. Beneath the financial records was a handwritten note addressed to me. "Talia, they taught you that strength means surrendering what belongs to you. It does not. Strength means protecting what matters, even when the people demanding your sacrifice share your blood." Those words changed the meaning of the cancellation. Mom needed me distracted during the trust transfer. Paige's breakdown gave the family an excuse to keep me away from the lake, while Mom finalized documents describing several withdrawals as authorized family distributions. When I asked whether Paige knew Vaughn hesitated, he said she received the money, but her knowledge still had to be established. My phone vibrated. Mom called twice, Dad called once. Paige sent 7 messages that began with, "I'm sorry you're upset," and ended with, "Don't punish everyone because you're jealous." I turned it over and asked what came next. I had to decide whether this remained a private family dispute or became a fraud investigation. All my life, Mom had solved Paige's emergencies by handing me the consequences. She used my education money, pushed me to co-sign an apartment Paige abandoned, and borrowed my contacts to hide Paige's problems at work. Each time I protested, Mom asked why I wanted my sister to suffer. In Grandpa's study, I saw how dishonest that question was. The real question was why everyone believed I was supposed to suffer instead. I instructed Vaughn to freeze every trust account, notify the banks that Mom's authority had ended, and preserve the calls and messages arriving from my family. I was not ready for police, but I was done protecting them. The next morning, I documented the house. I photographed broken windows, unpaid invoices, furniture my mother had claimed was sold, and boxes Grandpa had labeled by year. It felt less like an escape than evidence. One box contained my childhood artwork. Grandpa had saved portraits, watercolors, garden sketches, and my childish blueprint for a lakeside art center. Beneath them was an envelope marked for Talia after she learns the truth. Grandpa's letter described an incident I barely remembered. When I was 12, he created separate education accounts for Paige and me. Mine held more because I was older and had earned a place in an advanced art program. 2 years later, Paige was expelled from a private school after stealing an exam and blaming another student. Mom used my account to pay the school for silence. I was told the summer program had lost my application. When I was 16, Grandpa invested in a design portfolio I had started selling online. Mom closed the account after Paige complained that my success made her feel inadequate. I was told the website had created tax problems. At 22, a gallery invited me to participate in a group exhibition. Paige had just ended an engagement and threatened to harm herself if the family attended my opening instead of staying with her. Mom pressured me to withdraw, promising another opportunity would come. It never did. The letter included dates, bank statements, and Mom's messages. In one of them, she wrote that I could recover from disappointment, but Paige could not, so the family had to direct its resources toward the child who needed them more. Resources, not love or time. Favoritism had become financial policy. Because I kept functioning, she treated my stability as permission to take more. Paige learned the opposite lesson. Every collapse produced attention, money, and protection. Over the next several days, Vaughn brought in Amara Desai, an accountant who had worked with Grandpa's company. Together they traced the withdrawals. A pattern emerged. Whenever an investment matured, a document needed my signature, or Grandpa scheduled an estate meeting, Paige suddenly faced a crisis. A car accident without a police report, medical treatment without an invoice, an eviction threat involving a property my parents secretly owned, or a failed business that had never legally existed. Amara then recovered an email exchange. 3 days before my birthday, Paige had written to Mom, "Are you sure this will work? She already paid for everything." Mom replied, "She'll be angry, but she always comes back. Once she signs the revised authorization, we can reimburse the account later." Paige asked what would happen if I questioned Grandpa's company. Mom answered, "She doesn't know she owns it." I read it twice. Paige's crisis was a planned distraction. My family intended to cancel my birthday, pressure me into comforting her, and place financial documents in front of me while I was emotionally exhausted. Those documents would have transferred voting authority over Grandpa's company to Mom for another 5 years. A development consortium had increased its offer for the shoreline. If Mom gained control, she could sell the land, replace some of the money she had taken, give Paige a fortune, and continue presenting herself as financially successful. The lake would become luxury condominiums, and the artist retreat Grandpa imagined would disappear before I even learned it had been mine. I wanted to expose everything immediately. Vaughn warned that confrontation would reveal our evidence before the accounts were secured. I needed them to keep behaving as usual. They still believed I would return apologize for frightening Paige and sign whatever paper Mom placed in front of me. So when Mom called again, I answered. "Tala, thank God. We've been terrified." I made myself sound tired instead of angry. She said I had scared Paige, who believed I hated her. I answered that I did not hate anyone. She invited me home and mentioned paperwork about Grandpa's property. She said it was nothing complicated, no apology or concern, only the paperwork. I told her I would think about it. "Talia, we're your family," she said. For 30 years, those words had been a lock. Now they sounded like a confession. While my family waited, I learned to use the authority they had tried to steal. Amara reconstructed the withdrawals, while Vaughn explained my authority. I met contractors, reviewed records, spoke with company partners, and contacted an environmental foundation. Within 2 weeks, I replaced a financial manager who had approved my mother's questionable reimbursements. Within 3 minutes, I rejected the condominium proposal and opened negotiations that would protect the lake while still allowing responsible development elsewhere on the property. I also met with the director of an art school that had worked with Grandpa. Together, we began outlining seasonal workshops, paid residencies, and public exhibitions. For the first time, creativity was part of my future rather than something to defend. Paige continued calling. At first, she sounded apologetic. Then she became impatient and finally, furious. She accused me of punishing Mom over a birthday party. I told her the party was not the issue. Then what is this about? She demanded. She wanted to learn what I knew. I answered, "You tell me." The silence lasted several seconds too long. Then she started crying. Paige's tears had controlled me for most of my life. I would apologize and start solving her problem. This time, I remembered the email she sent before my birthday. She already paid for everything. Paige whispered that I did not care what happened to her. I answered, "I've simply stopped believing something has to happen to me instead." Then I ended the call and blocked her number. My new life began when her tears stopped controlling me. 6 weeks after the canceled birthday, I returned to my parents' house wearing a plain navy suit and carrying a leather folder. Vaughn waited in a car nearby. Amara had already delivered copies of the financial evidence to an investigator, but I had not yet authorized a formal complaint. Before proceeding, I needed to know whether Dad was passive or involved. He opened the door and hugged me with visible relief. "There's my strong girl," he said. The phrase nearly made me turn around. Inside, Mom had recreated a birthday dinner. A grocery store cake sat in the middle of the table, with 31 candles, because she explained they could celebrate the following year early. Paige waited in an oversized sweater, without makeup, carefully presenting herself as fragile. For a moment, the scene almost worked. Paige apologized for needing support at the wrong time. Then Mom placed a document beside my plate. "We should take care of this before dessert," she said. "It simply allows me to manage your grandfather's property until the estate is settled." I opened it as though it were new. Dad looked away. I asked whether he had read it. He said Mom understood financial matters better than he did. "That wasn't my question," I replied. Paige shifted in her chair and accused me of making the evening hostile. I looked directly at her and asked when she learned Grandpa had left the company to me. Her expression changed. Mom answered for her, claiming no one knew exactly what Grandpa intended because he had been confused near the end of his life. I told her he had passed 3 cognitive evaluations during the year he amended the trust. The room went completely still. I opened my folder and placed copies of the will, the trust amendment, the bank records, and the transfer history across the table. Mom went pale. By the 3rd page, Dad's hands shook. $416,000, I said. "That is how much was moved from the estate into accounts connected to Paige. Some of it passed through your joint account, Dad." He looked at Mom in disbelief. Her shock became anger. She insisted the money belonged to the family and accused Grandpa of creating unnecessary divisions. She said she had been protecting everyone. I asked whether selling protected shoreline to hide missing money was her definition of protection. Paige slammed her hand against the table and told me to stop pretending I had earned any of it. She claimed Grandpa had given me everything because I manipulated him by visiting while he was ill. I reminded her that I was the only person who consistently called him because she and Mom were too busy protecting their image to tolerate an old man who asked uncomfortable questions. The resentment beneath her crises surfaced. She did not only want support, she needed proof that anything I built could still be taken away from me. Mom stepped between us and said Paige had struggled in ways I could never understand. I told her I understood more than she realized and placed copies of the emails on the table. Paige saw the first message and stopped speaking. Dad read Mom's sentence aloud. "She doesn't know she owns it." His voice broke when he asked whether the cancellation had been planned. Mom stared at him as though his question were the betrayal. She claimed she had been preventing me from making an impulsive decision. Dad asked whether she had canceled my birthday to obtain my signature. "She would have signed eventually," Mom said. Dad turned toward me, ashamed rather than uncomfortable. He said he had not known about the trust. I reminded him that he knew Mom used my education fund, took money from my savings to protect Paige, pressured me to co-sign Paige's apartment, and erased my milestones whenever Paige objected. He said he believed Mom would replace the money. I asked whether he had ever checked. He could not answer. Mom began gathering the papers and declared the conversation finished. She told me I was emotional and that we would talk after I calmed down. I covered the documents. "No, tonight you listen." I told them the accounts were frozen, Mom's authority had ended, the land sale was canceled, and every relevant message and bank record had been preserved. Then I offered 2 paths. They could return every recoverable dollar, surrender all claims against Grandpa's estate, provide complete financial records, and sign a written admission describing what they had done. Or I would authorize a formal fraud complaint and let the legal process determine the consequences. Mom laughed and asked whether I would send my own mother to prison. No, I said. Your decisions might. Paige stood so quickly that her chair fell backward. She accused me of destroying the family over money I did not even need. That sentence erased my doubt. She feared only that the money had stopped. Dad asked what she had spent it on. The truth came out in pieces. Paige had used estate money to maintain an expensive apartment lease, a luxury vehicle, pay personal debts, fund a wellness company that existed mostly on social media, and reserve a destination wedding venue. Her boyfriend had ended the relationship days before my birthday after discovering she had lied about owning Grandpa's company. Her crisis was the collapse of the future she had stolen. Dad left the dining room without speaking. Mom followed him. Paige remained beside the overturned chair and whispered, "You always win." I looked at the cheap cake Mom had bought to prove that years of harm could be repaired with frosting. "No," I said. "You were simply protected from losing." I left the unsigned authorization beside her plate and walked out. That night, Dad called Vaughn and agreed to provide access to every joint account. Mom refused. 3 days later, she attempted to transfer the family home into Paige's name. That decision began a legal war. The house had been used as collateral for loans tied to Paige's supposed company. And moving ownership, while financial records were under review, triggered immediate concern at the bank. More accounts were frozen, creditors requested records, and Mom's public image fractured. Reputation governed Mom's world. She chaired charity committees, hosted fundraisers, and advised friends about responsible money management. We soon discovered that some of her most public acts of generosity had been financed with money that did not belong to her. Vaughn found estate payments to 3 charities where Mom had publicly presented herself as the donor. He also found transfers that covered events she had organized and later used to enhance her standing in the community. When the first charity contacted her, she blamed an accounting mistake. When a second asked her to step away temporarily, she accused me of conducting a smear campaign. I had contacted neither organization. The record spoke without my help. Dad moved into a furnished apartment and gave investigators passwords, tax returns, archived correspondence, and access to old devices. His cooperation did not erase his passivity, but it revealed that Mom had hidden more from him than I initially understood. For years, he had surrendered financial control because confrontation made him uncomfortable. He called it trust. I called it chosen ignorance. One evening, he came to the lake alone. He said he should have stopped what was happening. I agreed. He told me he kept convincing himself that Paige needed more help. I reminded him that helping her had always meant taking something from me. "You never fell apart," he said quietly. "That doesn't mean I wasn't harmed," I answered. He said he understood now. "No, you understand the consequences now." He flinched, but I did not soften the truth. Regret after exposure is not the same as conscience before it. Before leaving, Dad handed me an old phone he had found in a locked drawer at the house. It contained years of messages between Mom and Paige. The birthday scheme was only one part of a much larger plan. They had discussed convincing me to move home by pretending Dad was seriously ill, then pressuring me to appoint Mom as my financial representative. Paige suggested introducing me to one of her boyfriend's business partners so a romantic relationship might persuade me to invest estate money in their projects. In another message, Mom described me as emotionally predictable. "She'll resist, then feel guilty," she wrote. "Give her time." I read the messages without crying. By then, my anger had changed. It was no longer hot or chaotic. It had become structural, showing me exactly where walls needed to be built. The following morning, I authorized Vaughn to file a civil action seeking restitution, permanent removal of Mom from every estate roll, and damages connected to the attempted property transfer. I also approved the referral of the records to the appropriate authorities. I did not publish accusations online or call relatives to defend myself. Formal documents are quieter than revenge speeches, but they travel farther. Mom was served during a charity luncheon. Paige received her papers at the office she rented for her wellness brand. Within days, the consequences spread through the life she had built on borrowed money. Her landlord terminated the office lease for non-payment. Her luxury vehicle was repossessed. The wedding venue retained most of her deposit because the reservation had been made using false financial declarations. She called me from an unfamiliar number and said she had nowhere to go. I told her she could stay with Mom. Paige said Mom might lose the house. I reminded her that Mom had tried to transfer that house into her name to conceal it. "She did that because she loves me," Paige said. "She did it because she needed somewhere to hide it," I answered. Paige accused me of enjoying the situation. I considered the accusation honestly. Part of me did feel satisfaction, but not because she was frightened or losing expensive things. I felt relief because her decisions finally belonged to her. When I told her I would not rescue her, she insisted that I was still her sister. I reminded her that she knew Mom was taking estate money. Paige said she had not understood it was stealing because Mom told her the money would eventually be hers. And you believed you deserved it, I said. She answered that Grandpa barely knew her. You barely knew him, I replied. Then she began crying and asked what she was supposed to do. It was the first practical question she had faced without someone else volunteering to absorb the answer. I told her to find a job, sell what she owned, speak honestly with investigators, and stop treating every consequence as another person's emergency. Paige called me heartless. No, I said, I'm unavailable. Then I blocked the number. The civil case continued for months and exposed unauthorized borrowing, falsified expense reports, and personal purchases disguised as estate costs. Mom eventually agreed to surrender the family home, liquidate investments, return assets purchased with estate funds, and abandon every claim against Grandpa's property. The recovered amount did not cover everything, but it protected the lake from creditors and prevented the shoreline from being sold to satisfy debts she created. The criminal inquiry continued separately. Dad filed for divorce. Paige rented a room and accepted an administrative job. She told relatives I had destroyed the family because Grandpa loved me more. Some believed her. Others contacted me to apologize for years of watching the favoritism and saying nothing. I stopped campaigning for anyone's approval. The pattern had ended, and that mattered more than persuading every relative to understand why. At the lake, construction began on Grandpa's artist retreat. We repaired the original house, stabilized the shoreline, restored the workshop, and converted unused rooms into studios. With the art school's help, we created a scholarship for adults who had abandoned creative work because their families considered it impractical. I named the first residency program the Strong One. The name was not meant to celebrate endless endurance. It was a reminder that strength can begin with refusing the role everyone else assigned you. The work gave shape to years I had spent shrinking myself. Each contractor's invoice was reviewed openly. Every donation was documented. Every resident knew exactly what the program could and could not provide. I became almost obsessive about transparency, not because I wanted to live in fear of betrayal, but because secrecy had been the architecture of my family. Grandpa had trusted me with more than valuable property. He had given me a chance to build the kind of place I once needed, somewhere talent was not treated as selfish, joy was not rationed, and competence was not punished with neglect. 10 years after my canceled birthday, the lake property no longer resembled the neglected cabin Mom intended to sell. The original house remained at its center, surrounded by 6 small residences, 2 shared studios, a community kitchen, and an exhibition hall facing the protected shoreline. Artists came from across the country. Local students attended free weekend workshops. Environmental researchers used part of the land to study the lake and surrounding habitat. Grandpa's company became profitable without destroying the place he loved. I served as its director, but I also returned to painting. My work centered on family photographs, distorted by memory faces hidden behind glare figures. Cropped from celebrations, empty chairs where someone should have been honored. My first major exhibition was called The Strong One is Not Invisible. On opening night, hundreds of people filled the gallery. My family had once canceled a room of 40 guests because Paige's boyfriend left her. A decade later, strangers crossed state lines to see work I had nearly abandoned because my family taught me that her pain mattered more than my purpose. Mom did not attend. After the legal proceedings, she avoided prison through a plea agreement that required restitution, probation, financial monitoring, and community service. She lost the house, her board positions, and most of the social circle that had admired her generosity. She moved into a modest apartment and took part-time work in an insurance office. For years, she sent letters blaming Grandpa, Dad, and me. She described what happened as a series of ordinary family sacrifices that I had exaggerated into legal accusations. She insisted that a loving daughter would have handled everything quietly. I never answered. Dad visited the lake twice a year. He attended counseling, apologized without demanding immediate forgiveness, and gradually accepted that remorse did not restore access. Our relationship became polite and limited. I no longer hated him, but I also no longer treated apologies as a substitute for history. He had spent years choosing comfort over responsibility, and even sincere regret could not return the moments he allowed Mom to take. Paige changed more slowly. Without Mom's money and protection, she moved through several jobs and relationships. For years, she maintained that I had stolen her inheritance. Eventually, an investigator showed her Grandpa's original records, including the education accounts Mom redirected when we were children. Paige finally understood that she had not been deprived of an inheritance, she had consumed mine. The discovery did not transform her overnight. Real change rarely arrives with one dramatic revelation. She entered therapy, stepped away from social media, repaid a small portion of what she owed, and stopped contacting me through alternate phone numbers. 5 years passed before I received a letter from her that contained no accusation. She wrote that she had known more than she admitted. She may not have understood every legal detail, but she knew Mom was taking something intended for me. She had allowed herself to believe I could survive it because that made accepting the benefits easier. She admitted that she had been jealous and that she used fragility as a form of power. She ended with a simple apology. I kept the letter, but I did not respond. An apology can be sincere without creating an obligation to reunite. On the 10th anniversary of the canceled birthday, Vaughn called me. He had retired from regular practice, but remained trustee for one final sealed instruction Grandpa left behind. The release date was my 40th birthday. Inside was a letter addressed to all four of us and a recorded video that Grandpa required us to view at the lake if we chose to participate. Attendance was voluntary. I almost declined. I had spent 10 years building a life that no longer revolved around their explanations, and I did not want another family confrontation attached to my birthday. Then Vaughn told me the recording was Grandpa's final message. I agreed. Dad arrived first. He looked older and smaller than the man who once texted that I was strong enough to lose another celebration. Paige came alone, dressed simply, her expression guarded. Mom arrived last, with silver hair and a posture still arranged around control. No one hugged. Vaughn set a laptop on Grandpa's desk, opened the sealed file, and started the video. Grandpa appeared wearing the faded plaid shirt he had worn during our summers at the lake. He said that if we were watching, I had reached 40 and enough time had passed for consequences to reveal character. He described how Mom redirected money, attention, and opportunity toward Paige, how Dad surrendered responsibility to preserve temporary peace, how Paige learned to use instability as influence, and how I was rewarded for competence with abandonment. Then he revealed the final condition of the trust. It had originally contained a separate family fund worth nearly $1 million. Grandpa intended to divide that money among Mom, Dad, and Paige if they respected the transfer of the property and allowed me to control the company without manipulation. If anyone concealed the inheritance, misused estate funds, or pressured me to surrender authority, the family fund would be revoked and donated to the artist retreat. Mom stared at the screen. She had taken more than $400,000 trying to secure Paige's future, and in doing so, she caused all three of them to lose nearly $1 million more. Grandpa continued speaking directly to each of us. He told Mom that protecting Paige from every consequence had not been love. It had taught her that someone else would always pay for her choices, then allowed Mom to call me cruel when I refused to continue. He told Dad that silence was still a decision, and that surrendering authority did not make him innocent when another person used it to cause harm. He told Paige that pain deserved compassion, but pain did not create ownership over her sister's time, money opportunities, or joy. My happiness had never been evidence that she was neglected. Then Grandpa looked into the camera and addressed me. He said their regret did not purchase my return. I owed them honesty, not access. He told me to build the place we had imagined, and to celebrate every birthday they had trained me to surrender. When the screen went dark, no one moved. Mom finally whispered that Grandpa had set her up. Paige answered before I could. No. He gave us a choice. Mom turned on her and said everything she had done had been for Paige. My sister's response landed harder than anything I might have said. You did it because you needed me dependent on you. Mom began listing everything she had sacrificed. Paige interrupted. You sacrificed Talia, that was the problem. Dad left the study without speaking. Mom looked at me as if she expected either judgment or reassurance. I lost everything she said. I thought about the education money, the gallery opening, the years of estate withdrawals, the land she nearly sold, and the birthday she canceled because she believed my disappointment carried no cost. No, I told her. You lost what you believed you could take without consequences. She asked whether I would ever forgive her. Years earlier, that question might have trapped me for months. By then, I understood that forgiveness was not the center of my life. I stopped organizing my future around that question a long time ago, I said. Then I left the study and walked toward the exhibition hall where the staff was preparing my 40th birthday celebration. This time, no one canceled it. Nearly 200 people gathered beside the lake that evening. Residents displayed unfinished paintings. Children pinned drawings to temporary walls, musicians performed near the restored garden, and former scholarship recipients returned to talk about careers they had once been afraid to pursue. At the center of the hall stood a long table decorated with wildflowers. For most of my life, birthdays had felt like negotiations. I learned not to ask for too much, invite too many people, or appear too excited. My happiness made Paige uncomfortable, and her discomfort became my responsibility. At 40, I finally understood that joy does not require permission from people who benefit from your disappointment. Dad stayed for the celebration, but kept his distance. Before leaving, he handed me a small box. Inside was the engraved place card from my canceled 30th birthday. He had taken it from the restaurant after learning I donated the reservation. He said he had spent years imagining there might be some way to repair that night. There wasn't, I told him. He nodded and said he knew. For once, he did not ask me to comfort him. Paige remained near the back of the hall until most of the guests had left. Then she approached with an envelope containing a cashier's check for another portion of the money she owed. She said it was not much, but it was more than the previous year because she had been promoted. I congratulated her, and the word surprised both of us. We stood near the windows overlooking the water. Paige said she used to believe I had everything because I did not need anyone. She said she had needed people, and she had learned they would not always come. I answered that I knew. After a long silence, she asked whether we would ever be sisters again. We are sisters, I said. That doesn't automatically make us close. She accepted the answer without crying, arguing, or using it as proof that I was cruel. That quiet acceptance was the first sign that her changes might be real. I did not invite her back into my daily life. Reconciliation is not a prize someone receives for finally understanding the harm they caused. Trust returns through years of consistent choices, and sometimes it never returns at all. But I no longer hated her. Hatred would have required continuing to center her. Mom left before the celebration began. Later on, she sent one final message through Vaughn, accusing Grandpa of poisoning the family against her. I deleted it, without responding. Some people interpret boundaries as punishment because they were comfortable when you had none. Others insist that exposing betrayal is more destructive than committing it. But silence had protected Mom, not our family. Sacrifice had enabled Paige, not healed her. Dad's passivity preserved short periods of peace while allowing permanent damage to continue. The truth destroyed only the arrangement that depended on everyone pretending not to see what was happening. When it was time to cut the cake, the room began singing. I looked around at the artists, students, friends, employees, neighbors, and former residents who had built the retreat with me. No one paused for an emergency designed to interrupt the song. No one watched the doorway waiting for my sister to demand the room. No one expected me to surrender my moment to prove I was strong. I closed my eyes and made a wish, but it was not for revenge. Consequences had already delivered everything revenge could have promised. Mom lost the reputation she valued more than honesty. Paige lost the protection that kept her dependent. Dad lost the family peace he had purchased with silence. All three lost the future Grandpa prepared for them because they tried to take mine. My wish was that every person raised as the dependable one would learn what Grandpa had taught me. Strength is not a family's permission to neglect you. Love does not require you to finance another person's irresponsibility, hide their betrayal, or accept an empty chair at your own celebration. Sometimes leaving is not abandonment. Sometimes it is the first honest answer you have ever given. After the guests left, I walked alone to the edge of the lake. The retreat's lights stretched across the water toward the shoreline Mom had almost sold. 10 years earlier, I arrived with one suitcase believing I had lost my family over a canceled birthday. In reality, the cancellation exposed a family structure that depended on my obedience. I had not lost them that night. I had stopped losing myself. The following morning, I framed Grandpa's original note and hung it in the entrance hall, where every new resident could read it. Strength does not mean surrendering what belongs to you. Beneath it, I added one sentence of my own. Being family does not exempt anyone from the consequences of taking it.